welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and I have literally cornered Eugenie Scott, Dr. Eugenie Scott.
Good evening.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to read part of your bio because it's so impressive. I don't want to make any mistakes. Is that all right?
Sure.
So you're a physical anthropologist and the former executive director of the National Center for Science Education, and you're one of the founders of that, correct?
Yes.
All right. You have a Ph.D. in you have a Ph.D. in physical anthropology from the University of Missouri, and you're a proponent of church and state separation. And you serve on the National Advisory Council of Americans United for Separation of Church and State.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Anything else you'd like me to know?
No. There's other things as well. When you live as long as I have, there's a long list of stuff. So.
But I hit some of the big ones, right? I mean, that's pretty impressive right there.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
So when you were teaching at the University of Kentucky at Lexington, in 1980, a group of citizens wanted to start teaching creationism in the schools, and you opposed that. So you became leader of that opposition, correct?
Pretty much.
How did that come about that you took that under your own wing to do?
Well, I got interested in the creationism and evolution controversy when I was a graduate student in the early 1970s. And one of my professors gave me some literature from the Institute for Creation Research, and I was hooked. I thought this was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen, because here were people who claimed that they were doing science, and of course I was studying to be a scientist, and boy were we doing things differently. They had invented something called creation science, which was an effort to try to present really biblical literalism, 6 24-hour days, special creation, as you see in Genesis. Yeah, and present that as if it were science. So I really got interested in the creationism movement as a manifestation of philosophy of science, really.
Wow. And so how did that go?
Well, it took about a year. And
a year of court cases, or a year of public meetings with a select board? Or?
Oh, yeah. There was the Lexington elected school board met and considered this issue for probably over a year. And there were, monthly school board meetings, and people would come to testify and argue on one side or another. What we did is we formed a coalition of university scientists and educators, of teachers from the Lexington community, and members of the clergy, because members of the clergy didn't want somebody else's religion taught as science in the schools.
Okay.
Teachers didn't want to teach something that was clearly not science. And the scientists at the university, it was sort of the up with this we would not put. We certainly did not want science being presented in such a confusing fashion, because it just was very bad educational policy. So after meeting for over a year, the school board finally had its critical deciding vote. And there are 5 people on the Lexington school board. 3 of the school board members voted against instituting the policy, and 2 voted for it. In other words, we won by 1 vote, 3-2. And the swing vote, who was one of the school board members whose opinions we'd been watching very, very closely for several months, because he didn't really let on which side he was going to come down to. The swing vote announced at the deciding meeting that he was voting against the policy, not because the clergy was against it, not because the scientists were against it, not because the teachers were against it, not because it was terrible educational policy. He was voting against it because he thought it would cost too much money. Now, whether that was just an excuse because he didn't want to appear like he was anti-religious, because of course that is how the other side tended to couch the argument. Oh, well, if you will vote against this policy, you're really voting against religion. And actually, we were voting against what was really bad science. The fact that we had such strong support from the mainstream clergy, from the Catholics, the mainstream Protestants, the non-fundamentalist clergy in the community, the fact that we had their support really was critical to our winning in Lexington, because that put the lie to the idea that this was somehow a science versus religion thing. It was a bad science versus good science thing.
And so creationism, it doesn't sound like science, the word doesn't sound like science, but they were still presenting it as science.
This was something called creation science.
Oh, okay.
This is a neologism that goes beyond just the religious view that God specially created everything in its present form. You know, I've got no objection to that. I'm not a religious person. If you want to believe that God, you know, specially created everything and the planets and the galaxies, fine, live and be well. I'll let other Christians argue with you,
okay,
because that's not mainstream Christian theology. But if you're going to say that you're going to take that view and you're going to support it with science, then we have to talk. That's something I do have an opinion on.
And then later, you did not receive tenure at the University of Kentucky. I don't know if it was denied or you just decided not to go for it.
I was denied tenure.
You were denied tenure.
It was a devastating story at the time, of course. My department unanimously recommended me. The dean recommended me, but my tenure was refused at the university level. Looking back on it, I think that my activity in the anti-creation science campaign was a factor. Not necessarily in the way that one might, jump to the conclusion, but I think it was a factor in the sense that there was a fairly strong town and gown division at the university in the early 80s when I was there.
Town and gown?
Well, in that the university held itself apart as a city on a hill, so to speak. That, and the fact that I was actively involved in a school board situation, I think, this is my hypothesis, it's going to be very difficult to test, but my hypothesis is that I was viewed by some of the upper echelon as not really a serious scholar.
Oh.
As somebody who, if I really was a serious scholar, I would have just, stayed in my laboratory, stayed in my office, and kind of let all this public stuff go to the side. You
would have ignored what was going on right in your own backyard and just stayed in your university setting?
I think that was the expectation back then.
That you don't get mixed up in the mud, kind of thing?
Well, if you get too involved in community activities, that is evidence that you're not really a serious scholar.
No kidding.
I think that's changed. It's probably changed at UK. I know it's changed in lots of universities around the country, which is all to the good. I think there's much more of a recognition in universities that university faculty, whether they're in sciences or humanities or in business or any other field, do need to be part of the community. I think there's been a sea change in the last 30 years or so.
Wow. Well, when you first told the story, I was just assuming it was some kind of political fallout in a letter-writing campaign from townspeople, and I never would have thought that it might possibly have come from inside the university.
No, actually, I spent much of that year speaking to community groups around the city, and I was always very favorably accepted. I spoke in a lot of churches, but also for the Rotary and for community organizations. And things like that.
I'm sorry, it's just surprising to me that the university wouldn't want that representation.
Things have changed. Things have changed for the better.
Well, maybe you did that.
Well, not on myself, because this has been a national movement. I think there's been a recognition on the part of most institutions of higher learning that it is important to let the public see the face of the university and have that face be positive, and that you need to interact. Perhaps this is a function of so many state legislatures cutting back the funds to higher education, which has also been a national trend.
How did the National Center for Science Education come about?
Mm-hmm. The National Center for Science Education got started in the late 70s and early 80s because at that time, in living memory of some of us, there were efforts all over the country in state legislatures to pass laws requiring that if you taught evolution in the K through 12 grades, you had to teach this neologism of creation science, which of course was taking biblical literalism and pretending there's scientific evidence to support it. And teachers and scientists really were extremely unhappy with this. And it was clear that this was a national movement. It was cropping up in almost all the states. And these things have to be fought at the local level. All politics is local, as the old saying goes. And so teachers and scientists and other interested citizens would get together in states to try to fight these bills and keep them from being passed. Now, in order to do this, you had to have scientific expertise, you had to know something about educational pedagogy. It also helped to know something about church and state separation, right? Because this is fundamentally a First Amendment Establishment Clause issue. So in order that all of the 50 states didn't have to invent all of this information by themselves, we got together and formed these, we called them at the time committees of correspondence, based on the Revolutionary War committees of correspondence. It wasn't the British are coming so much as the creationists are coming. But we formed an organization to try to share information among various of these local statewide organizations that were trying to fight these bills. And out of that network, very loosely formed network of committees of correspondence, the National Center for Science Education was eventually established in the early 80s to be that kind of central hub of information that could inform other people around the country.
And you say it's fundamentally a church-state separation issue, but I can see one of the arguments right away being, no, we put the word science right after creation. Was that one of the arguments?
That was exactly why they called it creation science, so that they assumed that they would be able to duck the Establishment Clause issues. They already tried to teach creationism just straight up.
Of course.
Bring in the Bible
right.
and teach it. And that got smacked down really fast. That clearly is unconstitutional. You cannot advocate religion in the public schools. You can talk about religion, you can study religion, you can compare religions, but you can't say Buddha was right. You can't say Jesus was right. You can't advocate religions in the public schools. And when you're saying that, here we have evolution, that galaxies and the planet and living things on planet Earth change gradually through time, through natural processes. And now then we have the alternate view is that God poofed everything into existence like we see it today. You are advocating religion. And that's what the court said. So then creation science was invented to try to go under that radar, so to speak. Oh, this is just an alternate scientific view. Here's some scientific evidence. And of course, the scientific evidence was nonsense. It wasn't anything of the kind. Equal time laws were actually tested in the state of Arkansas. Arkansas had passed one of these laws requiring that creation science and evolution both had to be taught. And the law was challenged by a number of citizens and organizations. And the case came to full trial before a federal district court. The creationists brought in their best people to argue that creationism could be made a science. Creation science was a valid academic discipline. And of course, scientists and teachers were brought in to demonstrate that that was nonsense. At the end of a full trial, the judge decided that creation science was really just religion in disguise, and to teach it would be advocacy of religion and therefore unconstitutional. It wasn't until actually several years later when a Louisiana equal time law was also passed and was also challenged in the courts and was also declared unconstitutional, but this time by the Supreme Court, that equal time laws finally faded away.
So that was decided at the highest level. So you probably thought, yay, my work is done. I fought the good fight, but along came, I don't even know if it made it to 2005, but that's probably one of the most famous cases is Dover versus Kitzmiller, right?
Correct.
Which was in 2005.
Right.
And
creation science bit the dust. It was declared unconstitutional to teach it. That didn't stop the creationists. They turned around and invented intelligent design theory. Now notice that intelligent design theory doesn't use the word creation. This again is an attempt to try to move creationism back yet a step further from being obviously a religiously based view. And in 2005, Kitzmiller versus Dover tested a policy passed by the Dover School Board that teachers should be teaching intelligent design. In that case, a federal court judge listened to evidence on both sides, listened to the intelligent design people, the best people making the argument that this was a valid scholarly point of view. It was not just a religious view. And of course, people on our side of the issue who demonstrated that that was nonsense. And the upshot was that that federal court judge also ruled that intelligent design was just a repackaging of creationism. It was religious advocacy and therefore unconstitutional to teach in the public schools.
In that specific case, I read about it, and I read a book written on it, and it was actually, besides the intelligent design, the whole community it was a very bizarre social situation. I don't know how to describe it, but just from what your job was, fighting the case, and the social dynamics of the school board and the town, I don't know if you care to talk about that.
You have to realize that Dover is a small community, and people know each other in small communities. And when you have an issue that so polarizes a small community, you really do almost permanent disruption to the social fabric there. And it was clear that this issue about intelligent design really polarized the Dover community in very serious ways. I mean, people wouldn't talk to each other in the supermarket checkout lines and things like that. I mean, it got to be very, very serious. Things have calmed down a lot in the 10 years since Dover. And for one thing, the school board turned over almost completely. And the emphasis is back on trying to do the best job educating kids in Dover and not trying to bring in all of these other social issues.
Has anything else come up since then? Is it finally settled?
But that didn't stop the creationists. After Kitzmiller versus Dover finished off intelligent design as a strategy for getting creationism into the schools, the final and current strategy, which is much more subtle than anything that they have presented thus far, emerged. And where you see this strategy is in legislation passed in Louisiana and Tennessee. What happened is that a new set of laws started being proposed where instead of saying, we'll teach evolution and teach creationism to balance it out, or teach evolution and teach intelligent design to balance it out, they would argue, we'll teach evolution, but then teach the evidence against evolution to balance it out. Now, if you go to your local science department at your local community college or university and say, I'm a teacher, I've got to teach the evidence against evolution, please give me a list.
Right.
They will just look at you like, huh? There's no evidence against evolution. All the evidence that we have tells us that the universe has had a history, that there has been change over time in galaxies and on the planet Earth, and living things shared common ancestors, and they have changed over time. Everything that we have tells us that there has been this cumulative change in the universe, and that's the big idea of evolution. We have no evidence against evolution. We have a lot of arguments about the details, yeah, but there's no smoking gun out there that you can teach students to say, aha, see, evolution didn't happen. But the evidence against evolution, you can't find it at the universities. You can't find it in the scientific literature. Where you find it is, big surprise, in the creationism and intelligent design literature. So evidence against evolution is just a repackaging of intelligent design and creation science, just trying to move it further and further back from that establishment clause of the First Amendment to make it legal to teach. And it's a very subtle argument that might be difficult to challenge in a court of law, unless you have a judge, as actually the judge in Kitzmiller versus Dover, unless you have a judge that's willing to look at the history of this whole anti-evolution movement and see how over and over and over the argument has been made that, well, disproving evolution proves creationism. So all we really have to do is disprove evolution, and creationism wins by default. That is the way that creationists look at this subject, which is why the evidence against evolution strategy is what they're operating on now.
Except there's no evidence against evolution, so what?
So then you go to the creationist literature, where the creationist literature really, the creation science and intelligent design literature, really does depend upon taking science and distorting it so that it looks like there's evidence against evolution. So if you look at the creation science literature, what you'll see is arguments like, there are gaps in the fossil record, therefore evolution didn't take place. Well, actually, there are lots and lots of very good transitions in the fossil record. We have lots and lots of evidence that this descent with modification took place. The fact that the fact that you can't tell what Abraham Lincoln had for lunch on Wednesday, the 22nd of April in 1862, doesn't mean Abraham Lincoln didn't exist. And that's kind of the foolishness of the gaps in the fossil record. The gaps in the fossil record argument is based on this misunderstanding of evolution, that you have to show every little teeny weeny little stage, from the first single-celled organism to a modern-day barnacle or a modern-day human being. And you don't. That's not necessary. That's not what evolutionists believe is necessary.
So they're taking a philosophy first and trying to go backward with proof,
That's right.
Which is always...
They have a rather backwards way of doing science. They know what happened, and they're just going back and trying to piece out anything that they could consider evidence to support their point of view. Now, there's nothing wrong with supporting your point of view, but you can't stop there. The problem with creation science, intelligent design, the whole anti-evolution movement, is that they're not looking for the evidence that disproves their point of view. And that's what you have to do if you're really going to be doing science. Now, I'm not talking about evidence that disproves the existence of God or disproves that God's created. That's not what science can't prove or disprove that anyway. But what science can do is demonstrate that we have very good evidence that the planet Earth is billions of years old. The creation science point of view says the Earth has to be very young, only thousands of years old, because otherwise creation science dies right away. If there's enough time for evolution, they lose. So they distort science to try to prove to students and teachers and the public that the Earth is young, in order to support their ultimate conclusion that God specially created, that everything appeared all at one time in its present form. That is the basic point that they're trying to prove, and there simply is no evidence for that, and much, much evidence against.
Okay, now let me say something to you from a creationist standpoint. You made up the evidence on your side because you want grant money for further research. Do you find that, have you heard that before? Do you find it offensive? Do you find
I find it comical. I tell you.
Well, you drove up in a Maserati, right? It flew here in a private jet? You're in a corner in a hotel conducting an interview.
If you want a get-rich-quick scheme, you don't go into science, okay? This is just comical. We all laugh heartily when people say they just want to keep the big bucks rolling in. It's absurd.
Oh.
This is,
I had to ask.
A very good friend of mine is Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist, and Michael Mann has been accused in the ClimateGate and the other kinds of so-called exposés on climate science as being one of these scientists who is just promoting global warming to keep the big bucks coming in. It's pretty amusing. On another level, though, it's actually highly insulting. And it's also absurd on another level, because you're assuming that in a field that is as competitive as science, where, frankly, your success as a scientist depends on your being able to disprove somebody else's theory and demonstrate that your own and test your own and show that it's bulletproof. It's a very competitive and a very difficult field. You're assuming that a field that is that competitive is somehow able to keep this big secret across hundreds of thousands of scientists, that we're not letting the public know that evolution is a big fraud, or we're not letting the public know that climate science is really not is just pulling the wool over your eyes about the planet getting warmer. Not going to happen. You can't keep secrets like that in a field like science.
Let me ask you about some of the repercussions in a different light. I've read or I've heard, and I hope this isn't true, that some biology teachers don't discuss evolution. They don't present it. They ignore it.
I have bad news for you. That is absolutely true.
Okay, so it's true because they're worried about the fallout in their own community. They don't want to deal with the backlash, so they just ignore it and teach. It's not that they...
It's a kind of self-censorship.
So I guess then, now that you've answered that in the affirmative, my question for you is, never mind learning about evolution specifically, how is that just bad teaching? Because what's to be learned from evolution that will relate to other things like critical thinking? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's bad. Is it bad teaching to ignore such an important way of learning? Do you understand my question?
I believe I do. Evolution is taught most commonly in biology, life science, and in the earth sciences and geology. And the whole field of biology makes sense only if you understand that living things had common ancestors. Because this concept of common ancestry, which is what evolution is all about, explains why things are like they are in biology. Now, if you look at vertebrates, all land vertebrates, which is amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, all land vertebrates, creatures like us, have 4 limbs. 2 hind limbs and 2 forelimbs. We happen to use our forelimbs as hands, but think of a dog or a cat, 4 on the floor, as it were, okay? And that's true of amphibians, that's true of frogs, that's even true of snakes. They've just lost their limbs, but embryologically they have 4 legs just like the rest of us. Now, why is that so? Why is it that land vertebrates would have 4 limbs when insects have 6, spiders have 8, and they do fine? There's nothing magical about 4 limbs as being the best way to get around land. It's just not the case. In fact, sports would be a whole lot more fun if we had 6 limbs, wouldn't it? I mean, think about it. Basketball and a low. So why is it that all land vertebrates have 4 limbs, whereas all insects have 6 legs, all spiders have 8 legs? It's because the very first land vertebrate had 4 legs. And we are descendants of all of us land vertebrates are descendants of that first land vertebrate that had 4 limbs. It could have had 6 limbs, but it had 4, because the first land vertebrate is descended from an aquatic vertebrate. And when you think about a water environment, in order to move in a water environment, which is a 3-dimensional environment, you go forward, backward, up and down, left and right. In order to move in this 3-dimensional environment, you need a minimum of 4 limbs, 2 in front and 2 in back. The fins of a fish allow it to go forward, backward, up, down, side, back and forth. Now, one of those 4-limbed aquatic vertebrates became the ancestor of all of us land vertebrates. I think that's really neat, and it tells us, and evolution therefore tells us why things are like they are. If you don't understand the principle of common ancestry, biology is just a bunch of facts that you memorize for the test. So any teacher who leaves evolution out of the biology classroom is really shortchanging students terribly, and really making biology much less coherent. That's kind of a long answer, but...
It is, but they've been bullied into it, basically.
Yeah, I think a lot of teachers...
Or bullied out of it.
I think a lot of teachers feel that if they mention the E word, that students are going to complain, or parents are going to complain, or their administrators are going to complain. In most cases, that's not the case. Every state has state science standards, and these are documents that tell the school districts what to teach at what grade levels. And then the school districts determine the curriculum. So it's still local control, but there's these state guidelines that do help to shape what is eventually taught in the classroom. Every state standard has evolution in it. Not always really well, not always as fully as it should be, but they all have something to do with evolution. So all teachers should be teaching evolution, but many of them don't because they anticipate that they're going to get pushback. So there's a self-censorship that goes on.
So basically, if I can sum it up, if you don't teach evolution as part of biology, you're shortchanging the students. Biology really doesn't make any sense because why talk about it? There's no
It doesn't hang
cohesive.
together. It doesn't hang together. Very famous scientist named Theodosius Dobzhansky, great name, mentioned that biology becomes a pile of sundry facts. Interesting maybe, but making no coherent whole unless you have that framework of evolution. It's in chemistry. You would never teach chemistry without the periodic table. The periodic table gives a structure to the atoms and molecules and elements of chemistry. Common ancestry gives a structure to biology.
Dr. Eugenie Scott, former director of the National Center for Science Education, I thank you for being here. I thank you for meeting me in this corner of the hotel room. We were relegated here, and I know there's some bad shadows, so please nobody complain about that, and some background noise, but I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
It was fun. Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome.